People see the outcome long before they ever understand the cost, and that misunderstanding shapes how they think about life, success, and love. Because from a distance, achievement looks clean, decisive, and confident, but from the inside, it is chaotic, exhausting, and often isolating. And the truth is that before you become anything meaningful, life doesn't ask what you want, it asks what you are willing to give up. And most people underestimate that question because they assume sacrifice is temporary, that once you reach a certain point, the pressure will ease, the balance will return, and life will feel lighter. But ambition doesn't work that way, because when you decide to build something that matters, something that pushes the world forward, you are also deciding to live with constant uncertainty, relentless responsibility, and a mind that never truly shuts off. And that state slowly reshapes you, not in dramatic ways, but in subtle ones, in how you think, how you prioritize, and how you relate to people. Because when your thoughts are always 10 steps ahead, when your focus is locked onto problems that don't yet exist, presence becomes difficult, and love, which depends on attention and emotional availability, begins to feel like a competing force rather than a companion. And that's when relationships start to strain. Not because of betrayal or lack of care, but because of absence in moments that matter, because people don't need grand gestures as much as they need consistency, reassurance, and shared emotional space. And when you are building something extraordinary, your time becomes fragmented, your energy depleted, and your emotional bandwidth stretched thin. And you tell yourself that the people who love you will understand, that the mission justifies the sacrifice, and sometimes they do, at least at first, but understanding has limits, because love is not sustained by explanations, it's sustained by presence, and that's where the quiet conflict begins, because your life demands obsession, intensity, and relentless focus, while love asks for patience, vulnerability, and emotional softness, and those demands often pull you in opposite directions. And I've learned that you don't drift away from people suddenly, you drift slowly, one missed conversation at a time, one distracted moment at a time, one unspoken emotion at a time, until distance becomes normal. And by the time you notice it, it feels permanent. And the hardest part is realizing that the traits that drive progress, the refusal to slow down, the willingness to endure discomfort, the ability to compartmentalize emotion, are the same traits that can quietly erode intimacy, because when you normalize pressure, you also normalize emotional distance, and you begin to believe that love should adapt to your pace rather than questioning whether your pace is sustainable. And that belief doesn't come from arrogance, it comes from survival. Because when failure feels catastrophic, when responsibility feels heavy, emotional vulnerability can feel like a liability rather than a strength. And so you suppress it, delay it, rationalize it, telling yourself there will be time later, but later is an illusion. Because life doesn't pause for reflection, love doesn't wait indefinitely, and what people rarely talk about is how success can make you emotionally out of sync with the people around you, because your fears are different, your priorities shift, and your definition of risk changes, and that can create a gap that's hard to bridge. Because while others worry about stability, you worry about collapse. While others seek comfort, you seek progress, and neither is wrong. But they are not always compatible, and that incompatibility doesn't mean love fails. It means life demands choices, and those choices often come without clear answers. And I've spent a long time thinking about whether it's possible to build the future without sacrificing the present, whether love can survive in a life defined by urgency, and whether greatness is worth the quiet loneliness it sometimes brings. And the truth is that no one gives you a manual for this. No one prepares you for the emotional weight of becoming someone people admire, because admiration doesn't carry your doubts, your exhaustion, or your regrets, and the applause fades quickly when you're alone with your thoughts. And that's when you realize that the most difficult part of ambition isn't failure, criticism, or risk. It's the slow awareness that while you were busy building something for the world, pieces of your personal life were quietly slipping through your fingers. And that awareness doesn't come with clarity or peace. It comes with questions that don't have clean answers, questions about what truly matters, what can be rebuilt, and what once lost may never return. And that is the real cost of becoming someone. Not the work, not the pressure, but the emotional trade-offs you don't fully understand until you're already living with them. Love becomes complicated when your mind is never still, because even in moments that should feel quiet, warm, and emotionally grounded, your thoughts are moving, calculating, anticipating outcomes, and replaying decisions. And when you live in that mental state long enough, it starts to feel normal, even necessary. But love doesn't thrive in constant motion. It needs pauses, attention, and emotional presence. And I didn't fully understand that early on because I believed that caring deeply, being honest, and providing stability were enough. And I assumed that love would naturally adapt to the intensity of my life. But emotions don't adjust to logic. They respond to how safe, seen, and prioritized someone feels. And when your attention is always divided, even if your intentions are sincere, the people closest to you begin to feel like they're competing with invisible forces they can't fight, forces like deadlines, responsibility, and a future that constantly demands your focus. And the tragedy is that neglect in relationships rarely looks dramatic. It looks like distraction, like listening without truly hearing, like being physically present while emotionally somewhere else. And over time, those moments accumulate, creating a quiet distance that neither person knows how to address without fear of conflict or misunderstanding. And I've learned that intelligence doesn't protect you from emotional mistakes. In fact, it can make them easier to justify because when you're used to solving problems, you start to treat emotional gaps as temporary inefficiencies rather than warning signs, telling yourself you'll fix it later, that this phase will pass, that once things stabilize, you'll be more present. But stabilization is an illusion when your life is built around pushing boundaries, and love doesn't pause while you wait for the right moment. It responds in real time to how it's treated, and that's where many relationships begin to fracture, not from lack of loyalty or effort, but from misaligned emotional timing, because one person is waiting for connection while the other is waiting for breathing room. And neither is wrong, but both are slowly growing frustrated. And I've realized that providing materially or intellectually doesn't replace emotional availability because love isn't impressed by achievement. It's sustained by consistency, reassurance, and shared emotional experience. And when those are missing, even the strongs, T-bonds begin to weaken. And there's a painful irony in realizing that you can dedicate extraordinary effort to building systems, companies, and visions, yet underestimate how much effort it takes to maintain emotional intimacy. Because relationships don't scale the way businesses do. They require continuous attention, adaptation, and vulnerability. And vulnerability is especially difficult when you're trained to stay composed under pressure, to suppress doubt, and to project confidence. Because letting someone see your uncertainty feels risky when your life depends on decisiveness. And so you hold back, not because you don't trust, but because you don't know how to slow down enough to feel fully. And that emotional restraint creates a gap where misunderstanding grows, because the people who love you don't want perfection. They want honesty. They want to feel included in your inner world. And when that world remains closed, they start to feel like outsiders. And the hardest part is that you often recognize the importance of love most clearly when it's already slipping away. When conversations become shorter, warmth fades, and silence replaces curiosity. And at that point, no amount of explanation can undo the accumulated distance because love doesn't collapse suddenly. It erodes quietly. And I've come to understand that loving someone well requires as much intentional effort as pursuing any ambitious goal, because without presence, even the deepest care can feel invisible. And without emotional availability, even genuine love can fail to survive the pace of a life that never slows down. Loneliness doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in gradually, disguised as focus, productivity, and purpose. And when you're building something that demands everything from you, isolation feels justified, even necessary, because you convince yourself that this is just the price of progress. That once you reach a certain point, the weight will lift and connection will return naturally. But the truth is that loneliness at the top isn't caused by lack of people, it's caused by lack of shared reality. Because the higher the stakes become, the fewer people can truly understand the pressure behind your decisions. And that creates a distance that conversations, money, or recognition can't easily close. And I've learned that being surrounded by people doesn't prevent loneliness, because loneliness isn't about company, it's about being understood. And when your life revolves around responsibility, risk, and long-term consequences, it becomes difficult to speak openly about doubt, fear, or exhaustion without feeling either misunderstood or burdensome. And so you learn to carry it quietly, projecting calm and certainty while your inner world stays tightly controlled. And love becomes complicated in that space because intimacy requires openness, and openness feels dangerous when your life depends on resilience and decisiveness. And there's a strange paradox in success. Because use, while it amplifies your influence, it can shrink your emotional circle as people begin to see you as an idea rather than a person. And even those close to you may struggle to separate who you are from what you represent. And that separation can make honest connection difficult because vulnerability doesn't always feel safe when expectations are high and scrutiny is constant. And I've realized that loneliness is often reinforced by self-protection because when you've been disappointed, misunderstood, or emotionally hurt, it feels easier to retreat inward than to risk being seen again. And over time, that retreat becomes habitual, shaping how you relate to others, how much you share, and how deeply you allow yourself to feel. And the quiet danger is that isolation begins to feel comfortable, predictable, and controllable, especially when compared to the uncertainty of emotional closeness. And that's when loneliness stops feeling like a temporary phase and starts feeling like a permanent condition. And the hardest moments aren't public failures or criticism. They're the silent ones late at night, when the work pauses just long enough for you to feel the absence of connection, and you realize that no achievement can replace the basic human need to be understood without explanation. And I've learned that success doesn't create loneliness on its own. It reveals the emotional habits you already have. And if you haven't learned how to share your inner world, how to ask for support, or how to slow down emotionally, success will magnify that gap. And the challenge then becomes recognizing that loneliness isn't a weakness, it's a signal, a sign that something human inside you is asking for attention, and ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. It just makes it quieter and more deeply rooted. And the real work isn't eliminating loneliness, it's learning how to stay connected without losing yourself in a life that constantly demands more than it gives back. Regret doesn't always come from making the wrong decisions. Sometimes it comes from making the right ones at the wrong emotional cost. And that realization arrives quietly, without drama, often long after the consequences have settled in. Because when you are focused on building, surviving, and pushing forward, there is rarely time to stop and evaluate what those choices are doing to your inner world. And I've learned that you can be proud of what you've created while still feeling a deep sense of loss for what it required you to neglect. And that duality is uncomfortable because people prefer clean narratives, success or failure, happiness or misery. But life doesn't work that way. It lives in the space where accomplishment and regret coexist. And love is especially vulnerable in that space because it doesn't disappear when neglected. It fades slowly, quietly, often without confrontation. And by the time you notice, the damage has already been done. And the hardest part of reflection is realizing many emotional wounds are unintentional, caused not by cruelty or indifference, but by distraction, exhaustion, and misplaced priorities. And I've had moments where I look back and recognize that I was present for milestones but absent for emotions, available for problems but unavailable for vulnerability. And those realizations don't come with excuses. They come with accountability, because understanding why something happened doesn't undo the impact it had. And emotional awareness is painful precisely because it forces you to confront the gap between your intentions and your actions. And that gap can be difficult to sit with when your identity is built around problem solving and progress, because emotional mistakes don't respond to logic or optimization. They require humility, patience, and the willingness to admit that intelligence and success don't automatically translate into emotional wisdom. And I've learned that regret is not meant to punish you. It's meant to teach you where attention was missing. Because without reflection, ambition becomes repetitive rather than meaningful. And you risk building bigger things while shrinking emotionally. And acknowledging emotional missteps doesn't weaken you, it grounds you, because awareness creates the possibility of change. And change in this context doesn't mean abandoning ambition. It means redefining what success includes, because a future worth building should also be a future you can emotionally live in. And that requires learning how to slow down internally, how to listen without preparing a response, and how to be present without feeling unproductive. And those skills don't come naturally to people driven by urgency. They must be practiced intentionally. And reflection teaches you that love is not maintained by grand gestures or delayed promises, but by daily emotional attention. And that awareness often arrives after loss, when silence replaces connection and memories feel heavier than they should. And while regret cannot rewrite the past, it can reshape how you move forward, because the purpose of reflection isn't self-blame, it's recalibration. A quiet decision to carry ambition with more emotional awareness, to treat presence as a priority rather than a luxury, and to recognize that progress without connection eventually feels hollow, no matter how impressive it looks from the outside. In the end, clarity doesn't come from achievement, it comes from perspective. And perspective only arrives when you slow down enough to reflect on what has endured and what has quietly slipped away. Because when the noise fades and the pressure eases, what remains isn't the milestones, the headlines, or the numbers, it's the quality of your relationships, the depth of your connections, and the moments where you are fully present with another human being. And I've learned that success can fill your schedule, but it cannot fill emotional absence. And ambition can give you direction, but not meaning on its own, because meaning is created in shared experiences, in being understood without explanation, and in allowing yourself to be seen beyond what you build or represent. And the mistake many driven people make is believing that connection can always be postponed, that love will wait until the mission is complete. But life doesn't operate on timelines that respect your plans. And love isn't something you return to unchanged after long periods of neglect. It evolves, adapts, or fades depending on how it's treated. And the most important realization is that presence is not something you find later. It's something you practice now. Because the future you're working toward will only feel worthwhile if you have the emotional capacity to live inside it. And I've come to understand that balance isn't about equal time. It's about intentional attention, about choosing moments of genuine connection, even when everything else feels urgent. And that choice doesn't diminish ambition, it humanizes it, because building a future should not require abandoning the present. And love is not a distraction from purpose. It's a grounding force that reminds you why purpose matters at all. And the older you get, the more you realize that resilience isn't just about endurance. It's about knowing when to soften, when to listen, when to let yourself feel without immediately trying to fix or optimize the experience. And that emotional openness doesn't weaken you. It expands you, because it allows your achievements to exist alongside connection rather than in place of it. And what truly matters in the end isn't how much you built, how fast you moved, or how much you sacrificed. It's whether the life you created has room for love, reflection, and human connection. Because no matter how far you go, no matter how much you accomplish, a future without meaningful relationships feels empty. And the real measure of success is not just the legacy you leave behind, but the people who feel they were genuinely part of your journey, not sidelined by it. An understanding that doesn't come from failure, it comes from honesty, from acknowledging that while ambition can take you far, it is love, presence, and emotional awareness that make the distance worth traveling.